Are you passionate about foreign policy, national security, and the latest in domestic politics? Consider becoming a member of the DSR Network, your go-to source for in-depth analysis and insightful discussions. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code GRADUATE to receive 30% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code GRADUATE. Thank you very much for your support.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. One thing has become clear in recent days. Donald Trump is extremely confident that he is going to win the presidential election. He's openly railing about his criminal conviction and making a range of authoritarian threats right out in the open, blithely unconcerned about whether any of it will alienate swing voters. In one sense, this very well might backfire on him. NBC News reports that the Biden campaign hopes to draw out this side of Trump at their upcoming debate this month. But if Trump doesn't think these things are liabilities, he may advertise them all over again when voters are paying attention. Today we're discussing this with Dahlia Lithwick, the great legal writer for Slate, who co-wrote an excellent new piece laying out a pessimistic take that voters are getting lulled into complacency and aren't appreciating the true nature of the Trump threat. We're going to discuss whether voters will awaken to this threat or not. Great to have you on, Dahlia.
It's good to be with you, Greg.
Before we get to your piece, let's note what NBC is reporting. The Biden camp thinks they can use the upcoming debate to highlight Trump's dangerous authoritarianism. Biden himself recently highlighted Trump's suggestions that he will be dictator on day one and may terminate parts of the Constitution, and Biden said this: "All I have to do is remind people what he says and what he believes." In a sense, that's kind of a positive, isn't it, Dahlia, in that the Biden team sees Trump's overt authoritarianism as a political liability, right?
I mean, it's good that they're saying it, right? Neither of us doubts that in war rooms for years now, they've been talking about this. It's not that they don't know it. I think it's, the question is, why wait until now to sort of speak the words out loud? And it's a positive because, as I know we're going to discuss, there is this threat, and we have been minimizing it at every, sort of level of discourse. And so I think it's incredibly useful to hear them say, oh, this is happening. Maybe we should warn the people, because I think one of the things we know beyond a doubt is that the people don't know this is coming.
I'm so glad you said that about us minimizing this at every level of the discourse. It's absolutely true. We are doing that. And your piece really tries to correct for this. You co-wrote it with Norm Ornstein, and look, it offers a dark assessment. You guys conclude that voters may be telling themselves that they don't have to worry about Trump's threats because they're pretty persuaded the system will hold. Now, what's so good about your piece is that you guys explain that Trump and his allies are openly promising an authoritarian presidency. I mean, let's go through it. Plans to prosecute his opponents without cause, root out quote-unquote vermin, create giant detention camps to facilitate mass removals of migrants, including using the military, purge the deep state and stock it with thousands of corrupt loyalists, and so forth. As you guys write, most would-be dictators try to disguise these aims, then start to implement them once they've gotten elected. But Trump is turning that model on his head, isn't he?
Completely. And one of the most astonishing things to Norm and I wrote it with Norm Ornstein, and, we were sort of talking about the degree to which the Project 2025, it's not just like sort of a cartoon sketch. It's a really detailed piece by piece. There's nothing left unstated. And so you've got literally the playbook for all to see and think, first of all, about what it means, the comfort. This is where you started, Greg, the comfort level of putting that out there and saying, hey, here's our plan, right? This is not how most would-be dictators do it. But then I think one of the things we were really struck by, and I'm just looking at a piece that a chart that Jordan Weissman did at Semaphore about the number of voters who've simply never heard of Project 2025. And it's unbelievable, right? It's 76% of all voters have never heard of it. 71% of Democrats never heard of it. 81% of independents, 82% of Republicans. I mean, nobody is messaging this. And so I think that the point that we kind of wanted to make is that when they tell you who they are in black and white, believe them. And then the larger question, and I know it's the one you just raised, is why do we keep choosing not to believe them?
I think it's worth dwelling on Trump's use of language here. You mentioned the Jordan Weissman reporting. I reported a while ago based that some Democratic polling had found that alarmingly small percentages of swing voters had even heard Trump's most overt authoritarian threats. I think you even mentioned that in one of your pieces, too. I mean, let's talk about the language. When he repeatedly says migrants are, quote unquote, poisoning the blood of our country, when he invents new categories like migrant crime, there's no evidence migrants are driving a crime wave, and when he relentlessly dehumanizes the opposition and threatens to prosecute them without cause, I think he's trying to acclimate voters to authoritarian language, that is, get them used to it. What do you think?
100%, and this is standard, right? I mean, this is right out of the Hitler playbook. This is out of the Orban playbook. I mean, we know what people do with language in order to anesthetize, the public to what's really happening. So none of that is surprising. I think one of the things that is extra tricky about Trump, and we've been fighting about this since 2016, and I know you and I have been thinking about it since 2016, is there's always this kind of carve out for plausible deniability, right? I mean, it's always like, take him seriously, but not literally. He's doing comedy, kofeve, he can't control his words. So there's always been, I think, just a capacious space for him to say unconscionable things that had George W. Bush said them would have been disqualifying, right? Things that Mitt Romney wouldn't have dreamed of saying. And I think that there is a kind of a blustery style that Trump brought to the discourse that allows him to say things that in the mouth of anyone else, his career would be over. And this goes back to the, grab them by the pussy video. And he just moves through it. I mean, he literally just moves through that muck. And the public, I think, has been so conditioned to not take him literally or serious or figuratively, or, it's all just word salad. But in that word salad is the menace that he is planting, right? This ultra violent, dehumanizing language. And I think it's almost a double danger, I want to say. One is that we've learned to dismiss it as nothing. And at the same time, we've metabolized it, right? So that there is an entire quadrant of the society that uses the word vermin very comfortably now.
I think that what we are looking at here is a phenomenon that might be described as coding moderately. He kind of codes as if he's not serious, or he kind of codes as if he's a showman. This comes through on the issues as well. I think Sarah Longwell, the GOP pollster, has said she finds in her focus groups that Trump codes as a moderate on abortion, paradoxically or perversely, because they can't believe that he would give a crap about abortion at all because he's had so many affairs. They just think, he would pay for abortions himself if he could. He doesn't care about abortion. So there's this kind of weird dynamic where the more overt he is with this kind of stuff, the more people don't believe it. Isn't that kind of crazy?
It's so deep what you're saying, because it's really true. It's almost as though the further outside the bounds of what was normal yesterday that he goes, the more it seems like, this can't possibly be true. And also, then that becomes the new benchmark. So in a sense, what you're saying is he's training us to normalize that which is unspeakable, right? Like, we are the ones being trained here. And I think that it's really, I'm thinking about, I covered the trial in Charlottesville, of the Charlottesville Nazis that Karen Dunn and Robbie Kaplan brought, the civil rights trial against the people who marched in Charlottesville and in 2017. And one of the things I thought one of the most interesting witnesses and one of the most interesting trial documents was this guy, Pete Simi, Simi, and he kind of all of his research is in, sort of fascist movements and neo-Nazis and whatever. And he described this sort of front stage, backstage dynamic where, the things that the Proud Boys say, in public, and then the things that they say in private. Trump has no front stage, backstage. Like, he is not working from that, book of there are things we say to one another, and then there are the things, we say when we're out in front of the public. He has no front stage, backstage. He has no inside voice. It's only one voice. And in a weird way, instead of all of us glomming onto that's his real voice, that's the real plan, we've all glommed onto this is the comedy stylings of a buffoon. So we've learned the wrong lesson absolutely. His front stage voice is his backstage voice. That's the plan. That's not a joke.
I want to bring in what some of his allies do, because it's sort of like something playing out in the background. You often see Stephen Miller say something like, on day one, those mass deportations will begin. And I noticed a really telling quote in the New York Times piece on his plans for mass deportations and so forth, the whole immigration crackdown. Stephen Miller promised that it would be, quote unquote, spectacular. Okay? Now, I take that as a deliberate and very conscious use of language to advertise to the MAGA masses that you should revel in the cruelty that's coming, right? I think that what they're really trying to do is test how far they can get with this language without provoking too much public discomfort. And that, to me, is really alarming.
So two quick reflections. One is spectacular is a Trumpy word. That's not a Stephen Miller word, right? So right there, you're in the rhetoric of The Apprentice, right? You're in circus rhetoric. That's not political language. So Stephen Miller sort of clothing himself in that language is a choice. And I think that leads to my second observation, which is, remember in 2016, all the people who were profoundly uncomfortable pulling the lever for Donald Trump, but who assuaged their own worries and doubts by saying, he will be surrounded by adults in the room, right? He is going to be surrounded by the Rex Tillersons and by the, Jeff Sessions and the people who are professional politicians who are going to rein him in. And think about what it means that, both because all of those people have fled, right, or been fired or whatever, he is now surrounded in all of his mini-me's. There's no modulating force. There's not a message that Steve Bannon and Steve Miller and Mike Flynn are moderating forces. Now the message is he's crazy. Also, we're crazy. And
right.
Nobody seems fussed about the slippage from we have one sort of quasi-deranged would-be dictator who is all id and has no political savvy, but he will be surrounded by an architecture of serious, sober leaderships. Of serious, sober leadership, that's gone. Now it's that we have a fundamentally, a walking id who, by the way, before we just thought he was a sex pest. Now he's a convicted sex pest, right? Before we just thought he was a fraudster. Now he's a convicted fraudster. So by every measure, all the alarm bells should be flaring. And instead, what we have is, we don't want grown-ups in the room. We want more of him. And the people like you and I who respond to that by saying that is a marked shift from what they were selling in 2016, we sound like hysterics.
I think it might be even worse than you're saying. Not only are they saying we're not going to be a moderating force, they're saying we view him as a vehicle to do all the terrible things that we want done. They're saying it openly. I want to ask you about this, Dahlia. I think there might be a darker motive behind doing all this right out in the open as well. If Trump and his allies are openly campaigning on the offer of an authoritarian presidency and he wins, can't they essentially claim a mandate for authoritarian rule? They can say, this is what Trump ran on. In fact, Steve Bannon has said this. I think he said something like, just listen to Trump's speeches. He's telling you exactly what he intends to do. To me, this is the really dangerous undercurrent to this openly advertised authoritarianism. It lays the groundwork. It tests the public tolerance for this, and it essentially kind of creates an opening to say later, this is what we ran on, we're doing it.
I admire the virtuousness of your presumption, which is that they care whether or not they have a mandate. They didn't care in 2016 whether they have a mandate. So I'm never confident in saying that they, want to align themselves with what the voters voted for. The voters didn't vote for build the wall, even though you can't appropriate the funds, right? They just didn't care. It's its own form of normalcy bias, that you're imputing like rationality here. I
Right.
think that said, they are definitely trying to churn away at the Overton window, right? This is putting, to use Professor Jack Balkin's phrase, ideas on the wall that would have been off the wall faster than we can process them. And so I think you're right that this is its own form of training the voters to say, if we're okay with, mass deportations, if we're okay with not giving green cards to Muslims, if we're okay with giving contraception to the states or whatever other insanity that they are saying out loud. I don't know so much that it's like claiming that they have a mandate, but it is certainly training the public to say, maybe it's okay if contraception goes to the states, right? Maybe it's okay if Project 2025 is right and the father is master of the home and the woman, cook is chained to the stove. I think it's both. And I think that what frightens me, and this is sort of a little bit what animated Norm Ornstein and I writing that piece, is that kind of, I don't think we understand how acute normalcy bias is. And I think, you and I remember, because we lived through it, we kept saying, they're going to overturn Roe, they're going to overturn Roe. And we heard right up until the Dobbs leak, that will never happen. The human brain cannot integrate and accept that which it finds abhorrent. And I think a big part of this is that the Trump team now understands that whatever they throw at us, the vast majority of listeners and sort of people, sort of pushing their shopping carts through Target are going to just start to say they're not going to do anything crazy. And the crazier the stuff that they say, the less it is frightening to them.
Speaking of this kind of open advertising of this stuff, you guys also write about all the Republican lawmakers who are attacking the justice system as illegitimate as part of their effort to insulate Trump from accountability. I should add, this also includes efforts by House Republicans to sabotage ongoing current prosecutions of Trump. I think it's worth noting that these Republicans are openly declaring their highest allegiances to Trump over the rule of law itself. And to kind of link that back to your piece, isn't it pretty much certain that Republicans who are capable of this kind of thing will eagerly side with Trump if he's elected and starts implementing his most authoritarian designs?
Without a doubt, I think the most underreported and misunderstood story, in my view, and again, I'm a legal reporter, so I'm biased, is the assault on the rule of law and what it means to say, I'm not saying that the election was stolen. That was very 2020. That means I don't like the people, who were, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, who were counting votes. This is saying All the judges are in the tank against me. All the jurors are in the tank against me. The district attorney in Manhattan works for Joe Biden, right? This is the language of not assaulting the process of elections, but assaulting the administration of the law. And we saw that in E. Jean Carroll 1. We saw that in E. Jean Carroll 2. And, we've seen it in every single courtroom, in every conversation about the law. What Donald Trump and his minions, as you say, are doing is destabilizing confidence in a legal system that is, in my view, the very last bulwark against authoritarianism, right? I often quote, I interviewed for my book, Anita Hill, and I said, why are you so attached to the rule of law? The legal system has not done a whole lot for you in this world. And her very good point was there's no plan B. Plan B, once the rule of law has collapsed, once the American public has lost confidence that the law is fair and is unbiased and that it is even-handed and that it tries to sort of operate in facts and truth, once that's gone, we're fighting on the streets. And that's how authoritarianism sets in. And so the point that I wanted to make, both sort of in response to your question, but also in the piece, is that we keep using this language that is crazy making. We keep saying the law is holding. The system is holding, right? That the 34 felony convictions in Manhattan, that means the system is holding. And my two objections are, one, like, holding is not sufficient. It is not sufficient for something to hold when it is under daily, I would say hourly assault. But the other is it obviates our responsibility to hold it up, right? To protect it. It's not good enough to say the law is just going to handle all this. It's not. It clearly is not, because they're undermining confidence in it. So we have to put on our very long list of stuff we have to do in the coming months. Fight for the rule of law, fight for juries, fight for judges, fight for the entire sort of massive, rickety, outdated, genuinely terrible, racist legal system, because there is no plan B. And then we have to, re-up and rededicate ourselves to making it less rickety and less crappy. But I think that the notion that this is just, a sort of immutable cathedral of law has been proven wrong time and time and time again by Donald Trump. And so I think that the sort of passivity of saying the law is going to just fight for itself, that's going to be proven wrong very, very quickly.
I think there's no question that, and you get at this really beautifully in that answer, there's no question that one of Trump's core missions, right, is to obliterate the very idea that there can be legitimate legal outcomes. It's only tit for tat. It's only politics all the way down. The winner gets to prosecute. The loser gets prosecuted. That's the way it should be. That's the tenet of MAGA that he's really pushing on people. But, Dahlia, I want to try to end an optimistic note here, okay? I think there is a way that in the end, all this blows up in Trump's face, okay? Trump and some of his more authoritarian-minded allies may think that authoritarianism is a winning message, that majorities tacitly want it, or that they can be seduced into wanting it by creating, if Trump can create enough bedlam that they'll, want a strong, quote-unquote, strong leader to step in and rescue them from the bedlam Trump has created. But I also think this confidence could work against him, Dahlia. 538 just introduced their forecast, and they say it's toss-up. Some of the polling is edging in Biden's direction. I'm extremely heartened by all the polls that have showed majorities side with the verdict and that they think the trial was fair. So if Biden can draw out the authoritarian side of Trump at the debate, and if not there, then maybe, after the debate into the summer, isn't there a way that this kind of supreme confidence on Trump's part backfires on him?
So I have two data points that I sit with in response to that question. One is, again, I'm principally a Supreme Court reporter. And what I've watched in the 2 years since Dobbs is an entire country across partisan lines completely lose confidence in the institution of the U.S. Supreme Court, sometimes against interest, right? Sometimes communities that really wanted Roe v. Wade to end or really wanted more guns, who nevertheless say, oh, this is a completely partisan institution by huge margins. And so my feeling is, if the American public is savvy enough to be furious at a politicized, ends-driven, transactional, completely bought and sold Supreme Court, it's smart enough to understand that what Trump is doing is a whole bunch of much more violent versions of the same. So that's first. I think that the public is very much afraid of, a monarchic court, and it will be very afraid of a monarchic president if we can get past the fact that 76% of them have never heard of Project 2025. So that's my first point. I sort of see that as a case study in this can break through. Here's the other slightly more inchoate, but I think maybe useful data point. We know how much threats to democracy played in the 2022 midterms. We know how many January 6th Stop the Steal candidates were trounced or thrown out of office. I think it is a very abstract idea for most voters to think about democracy, right? I mean, it's not... I hope it doesn't sound in any way like I'm talking down to anyone. But when you're worried about the economy, when you're worried about whether you have to, you're going to be able to cross state lines to get an abortion, when you're worried about, because you've been told to worry about immigrants, then fighting for, 3 independent branches of government that check and balance each other is just not going to make your top 10 list. And yet, in 2022, we saw by huge margins people saying in exit polling that their vote was animated by threats to democracy. And so I don't think that goes away. I don't believe that just vaporizes. I believe we haven't, and this goes to your very first question, Greg, we have not messaged it. We have not figured out how to make it salient and relevant. We have not really, other than the Jan 6 hearings, which, by the way, were the single best vehicle for doing this, we have not behaved in this country as though this was a serious threat to democracy. And so I almost want to say, let's try to make this an issue and then see if it blows up in Donald Trump's face. Because right now, I think he's living his best life. He and his people around him are using this language with impunity. The press doesn't know what to do with it. Let me tell you, lawyers do not know what to do with it. I don't think any of us know how to take it literally or seriously because it's just numbing. And so my belief is that it will blow up in his face if and when we keep writing articles saying, one sentence, read the words in Project 2025. That should be my piece that I write every single day between now and November. That's all. We need to really break through the sort of normalization bias, the apathy bias, the tendency for people to think that you and I are always on fire and so it can't be true. And I think we haven't really tried. Not you and I. We have tried. But I think the political and media machinery that needs to step into this void now, I think if they try, we're going to see the kinds of results we saw in 2022 when people said, oh, given the choice between a lunatic who stormed the Capitol and somebody that I don't super love and may not want to go bowling with, but at least, is lawful, I guess I'm going to go for the latter. And we haven't tried.
100%. We should try. We should try to make this the issue and see if it blows up in Donald Trump's face. I'm so glad you highlighted the January 6th hearings because, in my view, they were maybe the most successful act of public political communication in decades, in our lifetimes, and for as long as I've been following politics. And I really hope that animates the spirit of how they approach what you're talking about here, which is how to make this an issue and how to make it matter to people. Dahlia Lithwick, thank you so much for coming on. This was such a great conversation.
Thank you for having me, and really thank you for all your work. I am, as you know, because I keep writing to you about it, but I just think what you're doing is the Lord's work. So thank you, Greg.
Well, likewise, you too. Thank you so much. Folks, some great new content for you up at TNR.com. Timothy Noah knocking down Trump's pledge to leave cash tips untaxed, and Matt Ford on the decline and fall of the Federalist Society's Never Trumpers. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.